a mother's worst nightmare, and an unimaginable truth. For 20 years, Ellie Carter searched for the daughter she lost on a beach, a child who vanished without a trace. But when her son introduces his fiancée, Ellie sees something chillingly familiar: a birthmark, a past that doesn't add up, a truth that could destroy everything. What happens when love and fate collide? Watch until the end to uncover the shocking twist. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. Eleanor Carter sat in her dimly lit living room, the fading glow of the evening sun casting long golden streaks across the wooden floor. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock standing solemnly in the corner. It had been 20 years, but silence had never truly settled in this home. It echoed, whispered, haunted. It reminded her of what had once filled these walls: laughter, tiny footsteps pattering down the hallway, the sweet scent of baby lotion and sun-warmed curls. Now, only memories remained. She traced a delicate finger over the worn leather cover of the photo album resting on her lap. The edges were frayed, softened by time and grief. She exhaled slowly, hesitantly, as if the simple act of opening the album might release something unbearable. And yet, she did. The first image was of her daughter, her little Lena, barely 3 years old, caught mid-laughter, her curls bouncing wildly as she reached for something just beyond the frame. A child frozen in time, untouched by the years that had stolen her away. Ellie swallowed the tightness in her throat, her fingers hovering over the picture, afraid to smudge the ink, afraid to break the illusion that Lena was still right there, just a breath away. She had been a mother once, she still was, but without a child to hold, to guide, to love, what did that make her? The past rushed back like an unforgiving tide. It had been a hot July afternoon when her world had shattered. The beach had been crowded, a blur of sun-kissed faces, the scent of salt and sunscreen thick in the air. Seagulls called overhead as waves rolled lazily onto the shore, their rhythm steady, indifferent. Ellie had been sitting on a blanket with her husband, Daniel, watching their little girl play in the sand just a few feet away. Lena had been building a lopsided sandcastle, her tiny fingers pressing seashells into the walls, her face scrunched in deep concentration. "Mommy, look," she had called, waving excitedly. Ellie had smiled, about to respond, when Daniel's voice pulled her attention away. "Babe, did you grab the sunscreen from the car?" It had been just a second, a momentary glance, a brief shift in focus. She turned, shaking her head, ready to stand, but when she looked back, Lena was gone. The world had spun violently on its axis. One moment she had been there, small, perfect, safe, and then nothing. She had called her daughter's name once, twice, each time more frantic than the last. The sand had burned under her feet as she ran toward the water, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. People turned, startled by the sheer panic in her voice. Strangers helped, their faces blending into a blur as they searched, their concerned expressions swallowed by the deafening sound of the waves. Hours turned to days. The lifeguards combed the shoreline. The police issued an alert. Flyers with Lena's bright, smiling face were plastered across town. But the ocean, the cruel, merciless ocean, had given no answers. Weeks passed, then months. Hope faded into an unbearable silence. The search efforts dwindled, and people stopped looking at Ellie with sympathy and started looking at her with quiet, pitying exhaustion. "She needs to move on," they whispered when they thought she wasn't listening. Even Daniel, her rock, had begun to crack under the weight of their grief. They had fought, lashed out at each other in their despair, their marriage unraveling thread by thread until there was nothing left to hold on to. And then he left. One tragedy had split into two, and Ellie was left standing alone in the wreckage, clinging desperately to a past that no longer existed. She had refused to touch Lena's room. It remained untouched, frozen in time, a shrine of toys, tiny clothes, and a stuffed rabbit, still perched on the pillow, waiting for the child who would never return. But Ellie had refused to drown. She had spent years searching, not just through police records and missing person databases, but through sheer, unrelenting hope. Every night, she whispered into the wind, a silent prayer to the universe that somewhere, somehow, her daughter was still alive. And then came Nate. 2 years after losing Lena, Ellie had walked into a small, worn-down orphanage on the outskirts of town, not looking to replace what she had lost, because such a thing was impossible, but because she had too much love inside her with nowhere for it to go. She had met him by chance, a boy no older than 5, sitting by the window, watching the world outside with eyes that were far too wise for someone so young. Nathaniel Carter, a child who had known loss just like her. His parents had died in a car accident. There was no one left for him. A boy without a home, a mother without a child. When their eyes met, something shifted. He did not smile, did not speak, but in that brief, quiet moment, a bond was formed. She had visited him every week, reading him stories, bringing him little trinkets, a book, a scarf, a wooden toy. At first, he had remained distant, cautious, but slowly the cracks in his silence opened. One day, he tugged at her sleeve and asked, "Will you come back tomorrow?" She had smiled through her tears and promised, "As many tomorrows as you'll have me." When she adopted him, she told him the truth. "I lost my little girl. I don't want to replace her, but I have so much love inside me, and I want to share it with you." Nate had been silent for a long time before his small fingers found hers. "Okay." And so, he became her son. Years passed, and though Ellie had never forgotten Lena, she had found a new purpose. Nate gave her life again. He filled the hollow spaces in her heart with laughter and light. He never called her mom at first. It was too big of a word for a boy who had lost too much. But one night, years later, as he drifted into sleep, he mumbled it against her shoulder, and the tears that followed tasted of both sorrow and healing. Now, Nate was a man. Bright, determined. An architect who built not just structures, but futures. He was everything she had hoped for in a son. And yet, Lena's absence remained a silent ache. She closed the photo album carefully and placed it on the table beside her. The clock chimed 8 times, marking the arrival of the evening. She let out a slow breath, reaching for her cup of tea when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A name she cherished. Nathaniel. A smile tugged at her lips, despite the heaviness in her chest. She answered, pressing the phone to her ear. "Mom?" His voice came through, warm, familiar, but tinged with something else, something bright. She straightened slightly, feeling a flutter of curiosity. "Yes, sweetheart." A pause, and then, "I have something wonderful to tell you." Ellie stood in front of the restaurant, smoothing down the front of her navy blue dress as she exhaled deeply. Tonight was important. It wasn't just about meeting Nate's fiancée. It was about seeing the woman who had captured her son's heart, the woman who would soon become part of their family. She had always imagined this moment, meeting the love of his life, welcoming her with open arms, watching her son step into a future filled with happiness. But beneath her excitement, a strange unease lingered, something she couldn't quite put into words. Pushing the thought aside, she stepped through the glass doors of the upscale bistro. The soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the warm glow of dim lighting surrounded her. Nate had chosen the place carefully, intimate, elegant, a place where big moments happened. And tonight was certainly one of them. She spotted him almost immediately. He stood near a candle-lit table, looking every bit the man she had raised. Confident, poised, but with a flicker of nervousness in his expression. And then Ellie saw her. Isabel Whitmore. The young woman turned as Ellie approached, and for the briefest moment something inside Ellie lurched. A strange, fleeting sensation, like stepping onto unsteady ground. Izzy was breathtaking. Elegant in an effortless way, with soft waves of auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, a smile that lit up her entire face. There was something about her presence that felt familiar, as though Ellie had known her once in another life. "Mom," Nate greeted, wrapping her in a warm hug before pulling back, his excitement barely contained. "I want you to meet Izzy." Ellie turned to the young woman, offering a warm but curious smile. "Isabel?" she said, reaching out her hand. "Izzy, please," the young woman corrected gently, taking Ellie's hand in hers. Her grip was warm, steady. "It's such an honor to finally meet you." Her voice carried a softness, a melodic quality that sent a shiver down Ellie's spine. She couldn't place why, but something about the way Izzy spoke, the way she looked at her, made Ellie's chest feel impossibly tight. They sat down, ordering drinks, exchanging pleasantries. Izzy was smart, articulate, kind, and as Ellie listened to her speak about her passion for medicine, her work at the children's hospital, she felt herself relax slightly. This girl was good. She could see why Nate loved her, and yet there was still that strange, nagging feeling she couldn't shake. Then it happened. Izzy laughed, tilting her head back slightly, and as she did, her hair slipped away from her collarbone, revealing a small, crescent-shaped birthmark just below the curve of her neck. Ellie's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. The restaurant around her faded, the soft chatter and music dulling into a muted hum. The mark. That mark. She knew it. She knew it too well. A birthmark like a thumbprint from the moon. A mark she had kissed 1,000 times on Lena's tiny neck. Ellie's world tilted dangerously. It's a coincidence, she told herself. It has to be. But her heart, or mother's heart, whispered something else, a truth too terrifying to comprehend. Nate didn't seem to notice her sudden stillness. He was talking, laughing, but Ellie's mind had become a storm of memories. The beach, the posters, the empty nursery, the cold, indifferent silence that had swallowed her daughter whole. She forced herself to breathe, to act normal as Izzy continued speaking, oblivious to the earthquake shaking the foundation of Ellie's reality. "Mom?" Nate asked, his brow furrowed. "You okay?" Ellie blinked, snapping back to the present. She managed a small, tight smile. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I was lost in thought." Nate chuckled. "Yeah, Izzy does that to people. She's pretty incredible." Izzy smiled, squeezing Nate's hand. "He's biased," she teased before turning to Ellie. "But really, I'm so happy to finally meet you. Nate talks about you all the time." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. How could she even respond? How could she sit here, smiling, talking about wedding plans, when a part of her was screaming that something was wrong? That the girl sitting across from her, her son's fiancé, wasn't just a stranger? Ellie had to know. She leaned in slightly, keeping her voice light but curious. "Izzy, where did you grow up?" Izzy hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "Oh, a little bit of everywhere," she said with a small smile. "My parents moved around a lot for work, but mostly North Carolina." Ellie nodded slowly. "And your childhood? What was it like?" Izzy's expression softened. "It was wonderful," she said. "Richard and Martha, my parents, are amazing people. They adopted me when I was about 3 years old." The world stopped. Ellie's pulse roared in her ears. "Adopted?" she asked, careful to keep her voice neutral. Izzy nodded. "Yeah, they found me, actually on a beach." She let out a soft, nostalgic chuckle. "I guess I just sort of appeared one day. No memory of anything before them. The police searched for my family, but no one ever came forward." Ellie's breath hitched. Her fingers trembled slightly against the tablecloth. A beach, 3 years old, a lost child never claimed. The edges of her vision blurred. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The room felt too warm, the air too thin. Every fiber of Ellie's being screamed, "This is her." But she couldn't say it. Not yet. Not here. Nate would think she was insane. Izzy, Lena, would think she was losing her mind. And what if she was wrong? What if it was just a cruel, impossible trick of fate? Still, Ellie couldn't unsee it. She couldn't unknow what her heart was telling her. The rest of the dinner was a blur. She smiled when appropriate, nodded when necessary, but her mind was 1,000 miles away, trapped in the past, in a moment she had buried so deep she never thought she'd have to face it again. When the evening ended, Nate kissed her cheek, thanking her for coming. Izzy hugged her warmly, her scent so achingly familiar it nearly brought Ellie to tears. "We should get together soon," Izzy said brightly. "Maybe a girls' day? Just us?" Ellie managed a small nod. "I'd love that." As they walked away, hand in hand, Ellie stood frozen in place, watching them go, watching her son disappear into the night with a woman who might be his sister. The thought was a knife twisting deep in her gut. She turned, walking numbly to her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She needed proof. She needed the truth. But how could she even begin to find it? And if she did, if Izzy truly was Lena, how could she possibly tell them? Ellie sat in her car for what felt like hours, her hands gripping the wheel, her mind racing. The night had swallowed the city whole, casting long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. Yet she remained frozen, staring blankly at the dashboard, her thoughts caught in an inescapable whirlwind. Izzy had said the words so casually, so unknowingly. Adopted, found on a beach at 3 years old, no memory of before. It was impossible, unthinkable. And yet, every piece of her being was screaming that it was true. Could it really be? After all these years, after all the sleepless nights spent whispering her daughter's name into the void, could fate have truly brought Lena back to her? And worse, could she have been sitting right in front of Ellie for months, engaged to Nate, the man who had been raised as her son? A wave of nausea crashed over her. If this was true, if Izzy was Lena, then Nate and Izzy. No, she couldn't let her mind go there. Not yet. She needed proof, something undeniable. She couldn't walk into her son's life and shatter it with mere instinct, with half-formed suspicions born from grief and hope colliding. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. She needed help. She needed someone who understood what she was about to do, someone who wouldn't look at her like she was crazy. Her contact list blurred as she scrolled until she found the name. Detective Carter Hayes. She hesitated only a moment before pressing the call button. It rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Ellie?" A pause. "It's been a while." Her throat tightened. "I need your help." Another pause. Then, "Where are you?" The old diner had barely changed in the 20 years since she had last sat in its sticky vinyl booths, gripping a cup of coffee with shaking hands, waiting for news that never came. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, the air still smelled like burnt toast and overbrewed coffee, and Carter Hayes still looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He sat across from her now, his sharp, world-weary eyes scanning her face with the same quiet intensity that had once made him one of the best detectives on the force. He was retired now, but he was the only person who had ever truly believed she would find Lena. "You sure about this?" he asked, folding his hands on the table. Ellie exhaled shakily, staring down at the untouched coffee in front of her. "No," she admitted. "And that's the problem. I need to be sure." Carter leaned back, studying her. "You know what you're saying, right? If you're right, if this girl really is Lena—" He let the sentence hang between them, heavy and unfinished. Ellie swallowed. It would destroy Nate and Izzy. Carter let out a slow breath. "Do you have anything besides gut instinct?" Ellie's fingers curled around the edge of the table. The birthmark, the details of her adoption, the fact that she was found on a beach the same year Lena disappeared. Her voice wavered. "It's not just a feeling, Carter. It's too much to be coincidence." He nodded slowly. "You need a DNA test." Her stomach twisted at the thought. "I can't just ask her," she murmured. "Not yet." Carter was silent for a moment, then leaned forward. "Then we start small." He pulled out a notepad. "What do you know about her adoptive parents?" Ellie swallowed. "Their names are Richard and Martha Whitmore." Carter nodded, scribbling the names down. "I'll look into them, see if their adoption records match up. But Ellie," he leveled her with a serious look, "if you do this, there's no going back." She met his gaze, determination settling in her bones. "I need to know." Over the next week, Ellie found herself watching Izzy closely, too closely. Every little movement, every familiar habit, every expression that mirrored a memory of Lena sent another ripple of uncertainty through her. She started noticing small things. The way Izzy tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the way she bit the inside of her cheek when she was nervous, the way she hummed under her breath when she cooked, the same way Lena had as a child. And then there were the pictures. Ellie had gone through every old photo of Lena, memorizing every detail. One evening, when Izzy had stepped away from her phone, Ellie saw a childhood picture of her on the screen. A faded image of a curly-haired little girl standing on a beach. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her own photo of Lena from her purse. They looked the same. She barely heard Nate calling her name. "Mom?" Ellie flinched, shoving the picture back into her bag before turning. Nate was watching her, frowning slightly. You okay? Ellie forced a smile, nodding. Just lost in thought. But she could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe her. Carter called 3 days later. You were right, he said without preamble. Ellie's heart stopped. What? The Whitmores. They never legally adopted Izzy. Ellie's breath hitched. What does that mean? It means they didn't go through the system. No formal adoption papers, no records. They just found her and kept her. Ellie's head swam. That's illegal. Yeah, but given the circumstances, they probably figured they were saving a kid from something worse. Ellie sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands shaking. Then that means... It means there's no official trail, Carter finished. No way to prove she's Lena without a DNA test. A lump formed in Ellie's throat. She had been right. She had been right all along. Ellie, Carter said carefully, what do you want to do? Her fingers tightened around the phone. I want to talk to them. The Whitmores lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with perfectly trimmed hedges and the scent of fresh-baked cookies wafting from kitchen windows. It was the type of place Ellie had once dreamed of raising Lena in. Richard and Martha were kind, too kind. Their warmth made it almost unbearable to suspect them of anything, but when Ellie sat down with them in their sunlit living room and gently broached the topic of Izzy's adoption, the change was immediate. Martha's smile faltered. Richard stiffened. Ellie's stomach sank. We found her, Martha said finally, her voice quiet. She was so small, alone. She didn't speak for weeks. Richard cleared his throat. We tried to find her family, he added, his voice gruff. Went to the police, checked the news, but no one claimed her. Ellie felt her heart shatter. They hadn't stolen her daughter. They had saved her. Martha's eyes softened with sorrow. Why are you asking this? Ellie's hands trembled. How could she say it? Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she forced out the words that had been burning inside her for weeks. Because I think she's my daughter. Silence crashed over the room. Martha's lips parted, Richard paled. And Ellie felt her world begin to splinter. Because deep down, she already knew the truth. Izzy was Lena. She had found her. But now, she had to figure out how to tell them all without destroying everything. Ellie sat in the Whitmores' living room, her breath shallow, her hands gripping the arms of the chair, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. The air was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them like a storm about to break. Martha sat stiffly across from her, her knuckles white where they gripped the edge of her floral-mittered skirt. Richard, usually a man of composure, was eerily silent, his jaw clenched so tightly Ellie could see the muscle twitching. The warm, inviting home suddenly felt suffocating. You think Izzy is your daughter? Martha's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes wide with something between shock and a fear Ellie couldn't yet name. Ellie swallowed hard, her throat dry. Saying it aloud made it more than just a gut feeling. It made it real. I know it sounds insane, she admitted. But Martha, Richard, everything lines up. Izzy was found on a beach, alone, when she was 3. That's exactly how old Lena was when she disappeared, and her voice caught, the weight of the words pressing against her ribs. She has a birthmark, a crescent, right below her collarbone, just like Lena did. Martha sucked in a sharp breath, her hands flying to her mouth. Richard, however, remained stone-faced. Ellie, he said, his voice measured but tight. We didn't steal her. Ellie flinched. "I never said you did." Richard leaned forward, his eyes dark and wary. "But that's what it sounds like, doesn't it? That's what you think." "No," Ellie said quickly. "That's not," she exhaled shakily. "I don't think you took her. I think you saved her." The words settled between them, the house unnervingly quiet save for the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. Richard's fingers raked through his graying hair as he let out a slow, heavy sigh. Martha was trembling beside him, silent tears spilling down her cheeks. "We always knew there was a chance," she finally whispered, "that she had a family out there. But after the first year passed and no one came forward, we just—" She broke off, her shoulders shaking. She was ours. Ellie's heart clenched. She had spent 20 years grieving the loss of her daughter, but now she was staring into the eyes of two people who had loved Lena in their own way, who had raised her, protected her, made her into the woman she had become. "Did she ever ask?" Ellie's voice wavered. "About where she came from?" Martha wiped at her eyes. "Not really. She had nightmares when she was younger. Would wake up crying, but she never remembered why." Her voice broke. "Maybe she did know. Maybe, deep down, she always felt something was missing." Ellie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Then we have to tell her." Richard's head snapped up. "Absolutely not." Ellie froze. "What?" "You can't just drop this on her," he snapped, his voice edged with steel. "She's getting married in a few weeks. You think you can just walk into her life and tell her everything she thought was true isn't?" Ellie's stomach twisted. "She has a right to know." Richard stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. "And what happens after, Ellie? What if you're wrong?" Ellie met his gaze, her voice firm despite the way her hands trembled. "I'm not." Silence. Long, heavy. Martha reached for Richard's arm. "Maybe we should—" "No," he said sharply, then exhaled, shaking his head. "Not like this. Not right before the wedding." Ellie's jaw tightened. "If I wait, it might be too late." Martha flinched, but Richard's gaze darkened. "Too late for what?" His voice dropped lower. "For Nate and Izzy? For whatever this will do to them?" Ellie clenched her fists. "For the truth." Richard let out a bitter chuckle. "And what if the truth ruins them?" Ellie's heart pounded. That was the fear eating away at her, that knowing the truth would break them apart, that it would shatter the love Nate and Izzy had built. But keeping it from them, that was worse. She stood, ignoring the way her legs wobbled beneath her. "I'm not gonna do nothing. I'm gonna find out for sure. And when I do, you're going to have to decide whether you love Izzy enough to let her know where she really came from." She turned on her heel, her pulse hammering in her ears, and walked out without looking back. The morning sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across Ellie's kitchen table. A steaming mug of coffee sat untouched in front of her, her hands pressed against the cool surface of the wood as she tried to steady her breathing. She had barely slept. The Whitmores had been hiding something. Not maliciously, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. And Ellie knew that same fear was tightening in her own chest, clawing at her ribs. She needed proof. A DNA test. Her fingers hovered over her phone. She had spent half the night researching private clinics, trying to figure out the best way to get a sample. She needed Izzy to agree. But how could she ask for something so intimate, so life-altering, without telling her the truth first? The answer was, she couldn't. Her phone buzzed. Nate? Her breath caught as she picked it up. "Hey, sweetheart." "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "You sound like you haven't slept." Ellie smiled, even though it felt hollow. "Just a lot on my mind." "Well, lucky for you, I have a distraction." A pause. "Izzy wants to take you to brunch today, just the two of you." Ellie's heart stopped. She gripped the phone tighter. "She does?" "Yeah," he chuckled. "She really likes you, you know. Wants to get to know you better before the wedding." A beat of silence stretched between them. Before the wedding. Before everything collapsed. Ellie forced herself to breathe. "I'd love that." The cafe was quiet, nestled between rows of trees that cast soft shade over the outdoor patio. Izzy sat across from Ellie, smiling as she stirred sugar into her coffee. "I was really nervous to meet you," she admitted with a small laugh. "I wanted to make a good impression." Ellie stared at her, something twisting deep in her chest. "She looks just like her." "You didn't have to try," Ellie murmured. "Nate loves you, that's enough." Izzy smiled, tucking her hair behind her ear, that same familiar motion. Ellie inhaled slowly. "Izzy, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Have you ever wanted to know more about your past?" Izzy blinked, caught off guard. "My past?" Ellie swallowed. "Your birth family. Where you came from." Izzy's fingers tightened slightly around her coffee cup. "I used to," she admitted, "when I was younger. But I have my parents. I have Nate. I have everything I need." Ellie's stomach clenched. What if she didn't want to know? But before she could say anything else, Izzy spoke again. "Why do you ask?" Ellie's throat felt like it was closing. "Because I think you're my daughter. Because I think the life you've built is about to fall apart. Because I don't know how to tell you the truth. Instead," she smiled, small, hesitant. "I was just curious." Izzy returned the smile, but there was something searching in her eyes, something Ellie wasn't sure how to read. As the afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the table, Ellie realized something terrifying. She didn't have a choice anymore. She was going to have to tell her. And when she did, nothing would ever be the same again. Ellie sat in her car outside the cafe long after Izzy had left, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Her hands trembled as she replayed the conversation over and over again in her head. Izzy had been so close. She had almost asked the right question, almost given Ellie the opening to tell her everything, but she hadn't. Instead, she had looked at Ellie with that soft, unassuming trust, the same trust a daughter should have for her mother. And that was what broke Ellie the most. She had been so close to telling her. But how? How could she say the words that would shatter everything Izzy knew about herself? She knew now that she couldn't wait any longer. The truth had already settled into her bones, had already changed the way she looked at Izzy, the way she heard her voice. Ellie could see Lena in her. The way she tilted her head when she listened, the way she laughed softly, the warmth in her eyes. But proof. She needed undeniable proof before she let the weight of her truth crash over them all. The next morning, she made the call. The private clinic was discreet, expensive, but fast. She scheduled an appointment for herself first, submitting a sample of her DNA. The next step was harder, getting a sample from Izzy. She would tell her. She had to. But she needed her to agree to the test first, and that meant talking to Nate. Her fingers hovered over his name in her contacts, her stomach twisting as she finally pressed call. "Mom?" His voice was bright, happy. Ellie felt the world tilt under her. How long would it stay that way? "Sweetheart, can you come by?" "There's something we need to talk about." The hesitation in his silence was new. He could tell something was wrong. "Of course," he said finally. "I'll be there in 20. She barely had time to gather herself before his car pulled into the driveway. Nate had always had her eyes. People had told her that for years, even though they weren't biologically connected. And in moments like this, when he looked at her with concern, with love, she felt like he really was her son in every way that mattered. "Mom," he said the moment he stepped inside. "What's wrong?" Ellie exhaled, steadying herself. No easy way to do this, no gentle way to say it. "I need to talk to you about Izzy." Nate's expression softened immediately, his lips curving into a familiar, affectionate smile. "She told me you had brunch yesterday. She really likes you, you know." Ellie's throat tightened. "Nate," she said carefully, "I think I know who she really is." Confusion flickered across his face. "What?" She took a breath. "I think she's Lena." The words landed like a gunshot. Nate's body went rigid, his smile vanishing in an instant. "What?" Ellie's hands were trembling now, but she didn't look away. "I think Izzy is my daughter." Nate let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. "Mom, that's not possible." Ellie reached into her purse and pulled out an old, worn photograph, the one she had carried for 20 years. She set it down in front of him. A 3-year-old girl on a beach. His eyes flicked between the photo and Ellie, his face pale. "She was found on a beach, Nate," Ellie said quietly. "She was 3. She doesn't remember anything from before. She has the same birthmark, the same eyes, and her adoptive parents—" Ellie swallowed, forcing herself to finish. "They never legally adopted her. They found her, just like we lost Lena." Nate's head shook before she was even finished. No, you're seeing things that aren't there. You want this to be true." Ellie's breath caught. "Nate," he pushed the photo away as if it burned him. "You don't know that. You don't know anything for sure." Ellie met his eyes. "That's why I want a DNA test." Silence. Thick, sharp, unforgiving. "You want to test Izzy?" His voice dropped. "Yes." Nate's jaw tensed. "And if it's true?" Ellie's stomach twisted. She had asked herself that question 1,000 times. What if it was true? What if it wasn't? Either answer had the power to destroy everything. "If it's true," she said carefully, "then she deserves to know." Nate was pale now, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And what happens if she's Lena?" His voice cracked. "What happens to me and her?" Ellie's heart broke. "I don't know." The words were so small, so useless. For the first time since he was a child, she saw fear in Nate's eyes. "Mom," he whispered, his voice raw, "we're getting married." Ellie squeezed her eyes shut. "I know." "No," he said, his voice sharp. "You don't. We love each other." His breath shuddered. "If you're right, then we're He couldn't finish. Ellie looked at him, and for the first time she wished she had never figured it out. But she had, and there was no undoing the truth. Izzy deserves to know. Nate's shoulders slumped. His hands ran through his hair, his whole body shaking. "And what if it's not true?" he whispered. "What if you're wrong?" Ellie's breath hitched. "Then I'll apologize," she said softly. "I will never forgive myself for putting her through this, for putting you through this. But if there's even the slightest chance—" She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "We have to know." Nate sat in silence for a long time. His breathing was slow, measured, like a man barely keeping himself from falling apart. And then, finally, he nodded. Ellie exhaled, relief and sorrow crashing over her all at once. Izzy sat across from her, confusion flickering in her deep brown eyes. "The DNA test?" she repeated. Ellie felt like a monster, but she forced herself to hold her ground. "I know this is a lot," she said gently, "and I wouldn't ask if I wasn't sure that there's a reason to." Izzy's lips parted, her brows furrowing. Nate sat beside her, silent. He hadn't spoken since they sat down. "Is this about my birth parents?" Izzy asked, her voice quieter now. Ellie swallowed, her fingers twisting together. "Yes." Izzy glanced at Nate, searching for something. And then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay." Ellie's chest ached. She had thought this would be the hardest part. She was wrong. Because nothing could have prepared her for what came next. The clinic smelled like antiseptic, too bright, too cold. The DNA test took minutes, a simple swab, a quick signature. But waiting for the results, that would take days. Days where Nate wouldn't speak to her. Days where Izzy watched Ellie with wary, searching eyes. Days where Ellie would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, terrified of what she had done. And then, the call came. Ellie froze, her breath locking in her throat. She picked up. "Ms. Carter," the doctor said, his voice calm, professional. Ellie's heart stopped. "Yes?" There was a rustling of papers. "The results are conclusive." Ellie felt her pulse pound. And then he said the words that shattered the world. "Isabel Whitmore is your biological daughter." The air left her lungs. And across town, in another home, Nate and Izzy sat together, unaware that their world was about to break apart. Ellie sat in the clinic's cold, sterile office, the weight of the doctor's words pressing down on her chest like a boulder. "Isabel Whitmore is your biological daughter." She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. She had dreamed about it, prayed for it, begged the universe to give her a second chance. But now that it was real, now that she knew, her body refused to move. Her fingers clutched at the arms of the chair, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. She had found Lena, her baby, her daughter, and she couldn't even celebrate because the truth wasn't just a miracle. It was a catastrophe. She barely remembered standing up, barely remembered the drive home. Everything around her blurred together, the world tilting on its axis, the trees lining the streets, the familiar storefronts, even the soft glow of the setting sun. None of it felt real anymore. By the time she pulled into the driveway, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the lock. Inside, the house was silent, stifling. The walls closed in around her. Nate, Izzy, how was she supposed to tell them? She sat at the kitchen table, pressing her forehead against her hands, her mind racing. There was no way to make this easier, No way to soften the edges of a truth so sharp it would slice through everything they had built. She couldn't put it off, not when their wedding was weeks away, not when Nate was still barely speaking to her, holding on to hope that she was wrong. She picked up her phone and typed the words with trembling fingers. "Can you both come over? It's important." The response was immediate. On her way. Ellie exhaled, pressing the phone against her chest as if it could steady the storm inside her. This was it. This was the moment she'd destroyed everything. When Nate and Izzy arrived, their laughter echoed through the hallway, light and familiar. For a split second, Ellie wanted to pretend it wasn't about to end, that everything was normal. But then Nate stepped into the kitchen, his face tense, guarded. He had been waiting for this conversation, and not in a good way. Izzy, oblivious to the weight in the air, smiled warmly. "Ellie," she greeted, moving to give her a hug. Ellie stiffened. The contact was too much, the warmth of her daughter's arms, the scent of her hair. It nearly undid her. She forced herself to pull back, her stomach twisting. "Sit down," she whispered. Izzy's smile faltered. She glanced at Nate before lowering herself into the chair. Ellie sat across from them, her hands tightly clasped together. The clock ticked loudly, an unbearable sound filling the silence. Nate folded his arms over his chest, his jaw tight. "Mom," he said, his voice clipped. "Just say it." Ellie met his gaze. "I'm sorry," she wanted to say. But it wasn't enough. She turned to Izzy instead. "I got the results back," she whispered. Izzy blinked, confused. "The results?" Ellie swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the table like a lifeline. "The DNA test." The moment the words left her mouth, Nate's entire body stiffened. Izzy didn't move. Ellie forced herself to keep speaking, to rip off the bandage. "It's true," she whispered. "You're my daughter." The silence that followed was unbearable. Izzy's eyes went wide, her lips parting slightly as she stared at Ellie in shock. For a few long, painful seconds, she didn't speak. Then, her voice barely a whisper, fragile, uncertain, lost. "What?" Ellie swallowed back the lump in her throat. I lost my daughter 20 years ago. She was 3. She disappeared on a beach." Izzy's hands pressed against the table. "No," she breathed. That doesn't make sense." Ellie's heart shattered. "It does," she said softly. "You were found on a beach. You have the same birthmark, and the DNA." She choked on the words. "Izzy, I know this is overwhelming, but I swear to you, I would never have put you through this if I wasn't certain." Izzy's breathing grew unsteady. But my parents," Ellie's chest ached. "They found you. They raised you, and I will always be grateful to them for that. But Izzy, you're mine." Izzy's hands flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat. Her entire world had just cracked apart. Ellie reached for her, desperate, but Izzy flinched away. The pain of it was like a knife to the gut. I don't... Izzy stumbled back, her chair scraping against the floor as she shook her head. I don't know how to... Her voice broke. Ellie's eyes burned. "Izzy, please." Stop." The scream came from Nate. Ellie flinched. Nate's face was white as a ghost, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had barely spoken since she revealed the truth, but now, he looked destroyed. He turned to Izzy, his voice hoarse, broken. "Izzy, do you understand what this means?" Izzy's eyes snapped to him, confusion, terror, and then realization. Her body went rigid, because suddenly it clicked. Ellie saw it happen the exact second it hit her. If Ellie was her mother, if she was Lena, then Nade was. Izzy's entire body trembled. Her breath caught violently in her throat, and then a sharp, strangled sob as her hands pressed against her face. "No," she gasped. "No, no, no, no." Her knees buckled. Nate caught her before she collapsed, his arms wrapping around her as she sobbed against his chest. Ellie's heart tore apart. She had thought she was prepared for this, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her son and daughter, the two people she loved most in the world, clutching each other in devastation. "This isn't happening," Izzy whispered, her voice shaking. "This isn't real." Ellie opened her mouth to say something, anything. But what words could fix this? What words could undo this nightmare? And then Nate spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. "Izzy," he said, "we can't be together." Ellie's vision blurred. And Izzy shattered. She wrenched herself from his grip, stumbling back, shaking, sobbing. And then she turned and ran. Ellie stood there, frozen, and Nate just watched her go. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His chest rose and fell in ragged, uneven breaths. And then, slowly, his eyes lifted to Ellie. There was no anger, no hate, just devastation. A boy who had lost everything in a single night. Ellie took a shaky step forward. "Nate." But he shook his head, his voice hollow, empty. "She was my future." A broken breath, "And now she's my sister." Ellie felt her world collapse, because she had found her daughter, but she had lost her son. The house was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the kind that lingers after destruction, the kind that fills the air after something irreparable has been broken. Ellie sat at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of tea in front of her. The steam had long since faded. It had gone cold, just like everything else around her. Izzy was gone. She had run out of the house without looking back, her sobs still echoing in Ellie's ears. And Nate had stood there, still and pale, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a stone. He hadn't said another word. He hadn't yelled or blamed her. He had just left. Ellie pressed her palms against her temples, trying to stop the pounding in her skull. She had done the right thing, that's what she kept telling herself. Izzy had the right to know. Nate had the right to know. So why did it feel like she had ruined everything? A soft knock at the door startled her. For a moment, she hoped, that it was Izzy. That maybe she had come back, ready to talk, ready to let Ellie hold her and tell her everything was going to be okay. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Izzy. It was Nate, and he looked wrecked. Dark circles framed his eyes, his jaw tense, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He hadn't shaved, hadn't slept. Ellie stepped aside without a word, and he walked in, his movements slow, heavy. He stood in the middle of the living room, staring at nothing. Ellie swallowed. "Have you spoken to her?" His silence answered for him. She exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. Where did she go? Nate let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't know. His voice was rough, hollow. She won't answer my calls. I don't even know if she's still staying with her parents. Ellie's heart sank. She had broken them apart. Sweetheart, she started, but Nate shook his head. Mom, he interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. I just need to know one thing. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. He turned to her then, his blue eyes sharp, raw. Not angry, not accusing, just lost. When you decided to do this, he said slowly, carefully, did you think about what it would do to us? Ellie flinched. Of course I did, she whispered. Did you? His voice rose slightly, something breaking beneath the surface. Because I don't think you did, Mom. I don't think you thought about what would happen after. Ellie's chest tightened. I'd thought about it every second, Nate, but what was I supposed to do? Pretend I didn't know? Let you marry her? He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands running through his hair. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what I wanted. But it wasn't this. Ellie stepped closer. Nate? But his voice cracked. She's gone. Ellie froze. She won't talk to me. She won't even look at me. His hands clenched into fists. She thinks I'm her brother. And she's disgusted with herself for loving me. Ellie felt the words like a stab to the chest. She doesn't blame you, he murmured, voice shaking. She blames herself. Ellie's lips parted, but she had no words. Because what was there to say? The truth had saved them from a terrible mistake. But it had destroyed them, too. Nate exhaled sharply and turned away. I just needed to hear it from you, he muttered. He was leaving. Panic rose in Ellie's throat. Nate, please. Don't shut me out. He hesitated at the door. Then, finally, he looked at her, his expression softer now, weary. I love you, Mom, he said, but I don't know how to be around you right now. And then he was gone. Ellie pressed a hand to her mouth as a sob tore free from her chest. She had found her daughter, but she had lost her son. Days passed, then a week, then 2. The wedding had been canceled, of course. The invitations had been thrown away, the plans, the future they had built together had been erased overnight. Izzy still hadn't reached out. Neither had Nate. Ellie was losing them both, and she had no idea how to fix it. Then, one afternoon, her phone rang. She nearly dropped it when she saw the name on the screen. Izzy. Her hands were trembling as she answered. Izzy. A long pause. Then her voice. Small. Fragile. Can I see you? Ellie exhaled sharply. Yes, she whispered. Of course. Izzy sat at the same cafe where they had shared brunch weeks ago, before everything had changed. She looked different. Tired. Thinner. Like she hadn't been sleeping. Ellie's heart ached. Izzy stirred her tea, eyes locked on the table. She hadn't spoken yet. Ellie swallowed. Izzy, did you look for me? Ellie's breath caught. Izzy finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes were red-rimmed, glassy. After I went missing, she murmured. Did you look for me? Ellie's throat tightened painfully. For 20 years, she whispered. Izzy's fingers trembled against her cup. I used to dream about my real mom, she admitted. I never had a face, just a feeling, like someone out there was waiting for me. Ellie's vision blurred with tears. "I found you," she said softly. "I found you, sweetheart." Izzy's lips parted, her chest rising and falling unevenly. And then she started crying. Ellie moved before she could stop herself, pulling her into a tight embrace. And this time, Izzy didn't pull away. She sank into Ellie's arms, sobbing against her shoulder, her whole body trembling. Ellie closed her eyes, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You're home," she whispered. Izzy clutched onto her tighter. They stayed like that for a long time. It wasn't fixed. It wasn't healed. But it was a start. The first time Ellie saw Nate again was 2 weeks later. She was in the backyard, drinking coffee, when she heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. Her breath caught. When she turned, he was there, standing on the porch, hands shoved into his pockets. She didn't move at first, afraid she might scare him off. But then he spoke. "She told me she saw you." Ellie nodded slowly. "Yeah." Nate shifted. How is she?" "She's trying." Nate exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Good." A pause. Then, softer. "I miss her." Ellie's heart clenched. "I know," she whispered. He swallowed hard. "I don't know if we'll ever be okay again." Ellie stepped closer. "You will be," she murmured. "It'll take time, but you will be." Nate stared at the ground. "I don't know who we are anymore." Ellie hesitated. Then she reached for his hand. "We're family," she said firmly. "That hasn't changed." Nate looked at her, something breaking in his expression. And then, finally, he nodded. He let her pull him into a hug, his arms wrapping around her slowly, hesitantly. Ellie held him tightly. She had lost so much. But maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost everything. The seasons had begun to change. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of falling leaves, and the sky stretched wide and endless above the Carter home. The world was moving forward, as it always did. Time didn't stop for heartbreak. It didn't wait for grief to settle. It simply moved on, and so did they. Slowly, hesitantly, but forward nonetheless. Ellie sat on the porch, watching as the golden sunlight filtered through the trees. She had been doing this a lot lately, sitting, thinking, waiting for the day when the wounds weren't so raw, waiting for the moment when everything didn't feel like it might shatter all over again. It had been months since the truth had come out. Months since Izzy had learned who she really was. Months since she had run from Nate, from the love they had thought they could have. Ellie had thought they might never recover from it, that the pain would be too much, that the brokenness would never heal. But then, little by little, the pieces had begun to fit back together. Not perfectly, not the way they once were, but in a way that mattered, a way that was real. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway drew her from her thoughts. She turned just as Nate stepped out, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow on his face. He looked better, still carrying the weight of everything they had been through, but stronger somehow, more certain. Ellie stood as he approached. "You're early." Nate shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Figured I'd come by and help." Ellie smiled, nodding toward the backyard. "She's already out there?" Nate hesitated, just for a second. Then he nodded. "Okay." Ellie watched as he made his way around the house, disappearing behind the trees. It was time. Izzy stood beneath the old oak tree, the one that had been in the Carter family's backyard for generations. It was a place of memories, of history, of moments that had shaped them all. She ran her fingers along the bark, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips. This place had always felt like home. Even before she had known the truth. She had spent so much time wondering who she was, wondering what had been missing, and now she knew. She was Lena Carter, but she was also Isabel Whitmore. She was both, and somehow she had to find a way to exist as both. The sound of footsteps on the grass made her turn. Nate stood a few feet away, watching her carefully. She exhaled, her chest tightening at the sight of him. He looked the same, and yet everything was different. "Hey," he said softly. She smiled, a small, hesitant thing. "Hey." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, finally, Nate stepped forward. "You've been avoiding me," he said, gently. Izzy sighed, wrapping her arms around herself. "Not avoiding," she murmured, "just trying to figure things out." He nodded, glancing up at the tree. "Did you?" She followed his gaze. "Not really." A pause. Then, quieter. "I miss you." Nate's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a second before looking at her again. "I miss you too," he admitted. Izzy swallowed. "It's different now." "I know." Another pause. Then she finally asked the question that had haunted her for months. "Do you ever wish we didn't know?" Nate let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he admitted. "Sometimes." Izzy's heart clenched. "But then I think about what could have happened if we didn't find out," he continued, his voice steady, certain. "And I know this was the only way." She nodded, blinking back the emotion burning behind her eyes. "I don't regret loving you," she whispered. Nate reached out then, hesitating only for a moment before tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "I don't regret it either," he murmured. She leaned into his touch, just for a second. Then she stepped back. "We have to start over," she said softly. Nate nodded. "Yeah." She exhaled. "As family." Nate smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it felt right. "Yeah," he repeated, "as family." The following weeks were a blur of healing, of figuring out how to exist in this new reality. Izzy spent long afternoons with Ellie, learning the things she had never known, stories of her childhood, memories of a life stolen too soon. She met with Richard and Martha, too, the only parents she had ever known before now. They had loved her. They had saved her. And Ellie. Ellie didn't resent them for it. Instead, she thanked them. "You gave her a life when I couldn't," she had said, tears in her eyes. "For that, I will always be grateful." And they had cried together, all three of them, for the years that had been lost, for the love that had never wavered. They weren't losing her. They were just sharing her. And Izzy finally understood. Love wasn't about choosing one family over another. It was about letting them coexist, about finding a way to belong in both worlds. Months later, on a quiet evening beneath the very oak tree where everything had changed, they gathered again. Not for a wedding, not for a tragedy, but for something new. A celebration of family. Ellie stood between Richard and Martha, watching as Izzy and Nate stood side by side, their shoulders touching, their smiles soft. There was no tension, no sadness, no lingering pain. There was only understanding, only love, As the golden light of the sunset bathed them all in warmth, Izzy turned to Ellie, her voice quiet, filled with something fragile and strong all at once. "I'm happy," she whispered. Ellie's throat tightened. "I never thought I'd get to say that." Izzy continued, "Not after everything." Ellie reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Izzy's face. "You deserve to be happy," she said softly. Izzy smiled. Then, carefully, she reached forward, wrapping her arms around Ellie. Ellie froze. Then she melted. She pulled Izzy close, pressing a kiss to her temple, holding her daughter the way she had dreamed of for 20 long years. Izzy sighed against her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, Mom." Ellie's heart cracked open. She closed her eyes, pressing her lips to Izzy's hair. "I love you too, sweetheart." And this time, she wasn't letting go. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Some stories are not just about what is lost, but about what is found in the aftermath. Life is unpredictable. It takes and it gives in ways we never expect, shaping us through love, loss, and the painful beauty of truth. This story reminds us that family is not just about blood. It's about love, about the people who stand by us even when everything else falls apart. Sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes it tears us apart before it can put us back together. But in the end, it is always worth knowing, because even after the hardest storms, there is always a way forward. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced a moment when the truth changed everything? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And before you go, let us know, where are you watching from? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.